Hi, and welcome to Progressive Podcast Australia. I am Nick, and I'm joined by another Nick on the other side of the world. Welcome to the show, Nick. Welcome back to the show, Nick.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
And today we're going to be talking, I guess, about anti-capitalism on the individual level, or sort of
Mm,
questioning capitalist logic in our own lives, sort of in our everyday lives and our interactions with other people, maybe at work, those kind of issues. And I guess like broader than that as well, of like challenging hierarchies and yeah, sort of challenging inequalities and hierarchies just in a more everyday kind of a way, I guess, in our own lives. And that's why we opened up with the song Strike by Petrol Girls, which had the lyric Disrupt the Logic. And the lyric is Disrupt the Logic that drives men to war, which I'm sure we also support, but more about, in terms of this episode, more about disrupting the logic of capitalism in, I guess, in perhaps more subtle ways, I guess, in terms of our everyday lives. And yeah, we are actually going to put this up on YouTube as well. So if anyone is listening to the audio and you'd like to watch a video, then yeah, you can check it out. We'll put a link to the YouTube video in the show notes. And if you're on YouTube and you want to listen to audio, you're probably on the wrong platform, so that doesn't make sense. But yeah, I'll put a link to the audio version there as well. And for those listening on YouTube, I will put a link up to the songs as well in the description as well if you want to have a listen to those songs. We won't edit them in, but you can have a listen to them if you like. And yeah, I guess I should sort of mention this is sort of a topic I've had in my mind for a long time, but hadn't done. And Nick on the show Pynk Spots had an episode with Pearson, and there was some discussions you had about working in a corporate environment and sort of making these very non-anarchist spaces more anarchist or less hierarchical in terms of decision making, gender, those kind of things. So yeah, they're the kind of issues we're going to look into. I think also for myself, I won't speak for Nick's points, but I think mine are almost like more symbolic kind of challenges, like not
mm.
necessarily like, very meaningful, but more about this sort of psychological battle we have with capitalism. I think like the Hunger Games, for anyone who likes the Hunger Games, there was a character, Peter, and he was always saying he didn't want to let them win. And I kind of feel like the same way with capitalism. Like me doing these individual things isn't necessarily going to bring down the system or whatever, but it's about sort of resisting that. But yeah, I want to hand things over to Nick and yeah, hear a little bit about why we're focusing, or why it's important to focus on perhaps less traditional activism, like not just focusing on demonstrations and rallies and direct actions and these kind of things that might come to mind when we think of activism, but actually we can do activism in all kinds of different ways that might be inclusive to a wider range of people.
Yeah, I love this question. I love this topic because I think for anyone who becomes, aware of their own and others' oppression, of course, you feel extremely compelled to figure out, how do I change this? How do we fix this? Right? It feels very urgent to you. And then burnout can follow shortly after because everything can feel really overwhelming. And I think one of the things that can be particularly overwhelming is this idea that the only way to make change looks or is defined in this very narrow way that isn't necessarily accessible to everybody. So I think if you're someone, for instance, myself, I'm not completely able-bodied. I suffer from chronic illness, and that can limit what I'm able to do, at least what I'm able to do without suffering long-term consequences from that. Um, and I know when I first got involved with veganism and then shortly thereafter, became really concerned with pretty much all social justice issues, I felt really overwhelmed by, I would go to protests, I would try to do different things that I was told that I was supposed to do to make a difference, but it never felt good. I always felt like I was kind of forcing it, and I would be extremely exhausted afterwards and just sort of uncertain and unsure the whole time. I didn't really ever feel swept up in this, like, yeah, I'm making a difference. I just felt like, oh, I feel really awkward and I don't know what I'm doing. Um, and I think, for me, it was really important to take a step back and start to, kind of jumping ahead, I guess. One of the biggest ways I think we can all dismantle capitalism within ourselves is to chase pleasure and to chase that really good feeling you get when you're doing something that you're meant to do. And I don't mean meant in this kind of faded way, but I mean meant in like, this is something that feels amazing when you do it, and you want to do it more, you want to do it often, and you want to commit yourself to being really good at it. And I think for a lot of us, those things may not be the things we're told that we should do, or those are the things that we're told are not the quote unquote most effective things to do. But what could be better in life than putting effort into something that you really care about, while also those efforts that you're putting in are rejuvenating instead of taxing, and are inspiring instead of deflating, and are things that instead of coming home every day and feeling like you're lost and awkward and you feel bad and you don't know what you're doing, you feel really good and you feel like you want to take on some leadership, or speak to other people and inspire them too, because you feel really comfortable with what you're doing. And so I think for all of these reasons, as well as the fact that if we look at what is considered effective activism, in quotes, we can see that a lot of these things are valued, because I would say they're tied into what we value from a patriarchal standpoint. So I think if you look at it's like action, doing, putting yourself on the line, right? Like getting out there, being loud, being seen. And it's not to say that these things aren't important. Of course they are. We know that direct action is extremely important in making any kind of change. Um, but we can also see why these things might be glorified over other things that might focus on behind the scenes activities or art or long-term change, things that you want to do, like build community with other people, things that don't have a direct confrontation with authority, but do undermine that authority at the same time. So I think it's really important for us to always be looking at, why is this thing valued? And why is this other thing not valued? And I think 9 times out of 10, at least, we're going to see that it's because that thing that's valued has either extroverted or kind of masculine qualities to it that are typically more revered by our culture than stuff that might be a bit more gentle or subtle or behind the scenes. And that doesn't mean that those things aren't equally important. It just means they're not equally valued.
Mhm. Yep, for sure. And yeah, I definitely started out in sort of vegan animal advocacy as well. And yeah, I guess linking to our discussion today as well, in terms of talking about, yeah, challenging capitalism in sort of subtle individual ways. I think, yeah, one thing I've sort of moved towards in my more animal advocacy, which kind of looks different to it once did, in terms of more, I guess, like speaking about animals more than sort of doing street stalls and outreach, those kind of things. But it is moving away from like a hypocrisy narrative, which I very much focused on in my activism in the past, particularly because I'm very sick of sort of seeing, particularly like right-wing critiques of anyone who goes to a climate protest. If they have any sort of carbon footprint at all, they're hypocritical and that kind of thing, and sort of seeing the parallels with some of the messaging within vegan movements as well. So that's certainly not what we're doing in this discussion, in terms of going, oh, you're an anti-capitalist, but you use money, therefore you're, yeah, we're definitely not kind of going to those roads, but down that road. But again, more to sort of subtle ways we can kind of challenge the system as well. And I think also for those who, for whatever reason, don't sort of thrive in a more traditional activist environment, like rallies, protests, those kind of things, whether people are have a disability, or perhaps are just more introverted, or whatever the case may be. I think when you feel that sense of obligation, like I'm not empowered by this, I don't enjoy this, but I have to do it, or I feel guilty if I
Mm.
don't do it. I think that's where we get issues of burnout coming in as well. I think if you're not doing the kind of activism that does kind of connect with who you are as well. So I think that's another important point in this whole discussion as well, of finding the activism that you like, whatever that is, even if it is like less sort of masculine or whatever it may be, as well as sort of a method to avoid burnout too.
Yeah. And I think another thing that has kind of occurred to me over time that I think is really important to note is that honestly, almost any act of resistance, whatever it looks like, does carry with it some risk. And I think we fall into this trap of thinking that someone who isn't out physically on the front line is the only person taking any kind of risk. And I think that adds a bit of this idea that that's the quote unquote real work. But I've come to realize over time, like being a person on the internet, I'm trying to be more careful about protecting my legal name and not being as accessible as I once was, because there's risk in that. There's risk in even having a podcast or making any kind of art, or even being a local organizer of something that's not necessarily directly protesting or rallies, but still has any kind of anarchist or radical leftist leanings. And I think that that's really important. And it's important to acknowledge that so we can give our comrades proper support whenever they're stepping up to things. And it's also important to just see that there's, I think, to me, the reason I bring it up is because it highlights that you are doing something. If there's risk in it, then it does matter. You know what I'm saying? Like, if there's risk in it, if the government or the state or the people in power don't like it, then you are doing something. And I think that's really important to remember and be really emboldened by. I was thinking, when I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about my friend told me, and she couldn't remember for sure who it was, but one of the like Black feminist authors, one of the super famous ones, and I would guess probably all of them actually, was critiqued for focusing on writing versus direct action. And we're talking like a Toni Morrison or an Octavia Butler or an Audre Lorde. I mean, these people, James Baldwin, I mean, these people who have like really had a massive impact on us were critiqued for not being out in the streets more, and were critiqued for being bougie, for being writers. But we can see in hindsight, right, how important what they were doing was. And we can see that also, they may not have been in the same level of risk as maybe a Black Panther, but they certainly weren't completely safe either. What they were doing was really important. And it has lasted too. And I think that's another thing that we need to consider when we think of art and we think of these quote unquote softer ways of resisting, is that some of these things can persist for a lot longer than something like a short-term direct action can. And again, not to say that one's more important than the other, but I think we can see with that longevity, there's something really beautiful there, and there's something really important there to a thing that can outlast even your own life, that can inspire people into the future. Because we know, looking back, I mean, some of these struggles have been happening for literally hundreds of years. So nothing is going to happen truly in the short term. These fights are going to happen for a very long time. And so, yes, we need direct action. We need protests and demonstrations and people taking those kind of risks. But we also need things that can persist, because the odds are, our future generations are still going to be fighting some of these same fights. And I know for me, reading speeches that Black Panthers gave, decades ago, and being like, shit, they could say this today and it would like literally word for word still resonate. It's demoralizing. But it's also kind of beautiful that I can still be inspired by these people, not just in this hazy kind of mythological way, but in a way where I'm like, wow, they're really speaking to the moment even still. And I think that we get that from artists, right? We get things that we can reach to today when we're hurting and get something out of.
Yeah, and I think to give an Australian example, our government, this was a few sort of administrations back, but when we had Tony Abbott as our prime minister, they actually spent a lot of money monitoring social media, like what was said about
Mm.
that government, and so people often say it doesn't do anything, but it's like, why are they spending all that money to monitor that if they don't care about it? So yeah, I think these things can have an impact. And yeah, also I think it's also important to keep in mind that, like, as social movements, we do need, demonstrations and rallies and direct action and all these tactics as a movement, but that doesn't mean every individual within those movements has to do all, or necessarily any of those tactics. We can be doing these different things. And yeah, I think particularly in terms of like yeah, in terms of the environment, like, yeah, individual actions are kind of limited in a way when it does come to the environment, almost whatever that individual action is. But again, it doesn't
Mm.
mean that we can't be doing these different things, and depending on our own abilities and passions and those kind of things. And I think also not only that as well, I think that these kind of discussions, are quite relevant even for those who are doing those, you know doing direct actions and demonstrations and those kind of things all the time. They still do, have, interactions with people. They do often have, going to work and interacting with co-workers, that kind of thing as well. So I think it could be relevant to them. It doesn't necessarily
Mhm.
have to be. I did want to mention as well, I think of a lot of your discussions around people with disabilities and people who are neurotypical, that kind of thing. It definitely doesn't have to be for me. It doesn't have to be for the normalos who are not neurodivergent, or have disabilities or whatever. But I actually have got a lot out of those discussions as well. So I think, yeah, again, it can be sort of for groups who don't are less comfortable with this more traditional forms of activism. But I think also, again, for others as well. And just on a little side note, while we've got the video as well, definitely your discussions about to-do lists really sort of hit me as well. I'm not sure if you can kind of see that, but that was my
Yeah.
to-do list from last year. And basically every week was basically like that, where I've got
Wow.
just like, yeah, the whole thing is full. And what
Love
I'd
that.
do is I'd have these ongoing things that I'd actually write on there, not get it
Mhm.
done that week, and then cross it out and write it the next week. And it was like, sort of
Mhm.
psychologically, it was this constant feeling like I'm behind. It was sort of like the idea of like both like taking on too much and needing to challenge that, but also trying to like organize those tasks in a way that didn't give the perception that I was behind the things as well. So we did spoke about this a bit on an episode we did a while ago called Apathy and Exhaustion, because it's both
Mm.
like feeling like you're not doing enough and also feeling like you're doing way too much at the same time, in terms of like feeling like there's all these activists doing all this stuff all the time. I'm not doing that stuff, but yet I still feel like I'm doing too much as well. And so that is something in more recent times I have got a bit more on top of, mainly through not using a diary, but just using like the Google Calendar and just having things go off so I can just see that day and other things out of mind. And also, again, while we've got the video, having like this whiteboard, where I've
Mhm.
got I've got a to-do list there. I've got like article ideas up there.
I
Um,
love that.
and then when I'm that just goes behind my computer, so I can't actually see it. So
Mhm.
basically, I can't see that list. It's sort of just, it's against my computer, like the whiteboard bit facing into my computer. And so when I feel like doing things, 'cause they're not urgent things, like you said, they're not things that have to be done this week. They're things like get our podcast on Spotify. That doesn't have to be done this week or anything like that. But it's like, if I feel like doing those things, I pull that out and I can do those things. But I don't have these constant things like in my diary life. It's got all these things as well. So yeah, again, I
Love it.
think that some of these discussions can be relevant even if they're not necessarily the groups that we're aiming for. But obviously, it's totally fine to also speak to a particular group too. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I think anytime you kind of look at, say, the title of a podcast and you think, oh, that's not for me because it's for this group of people, I think listen to it, that is for you, because you may not, it may give you insight into the way someone else's brain works, someone else's lived experience, and we can all always learn from each other, and that's why I love making content for disabled and neurodivergent people, but that I also feel is really good for everyone, because then you get to have that viewpoint into like my lived experience, and maybe that helps you understand how other people feel, and what they're capable of, and what's hard for them, and what's easy for them. But yeah, at the same time, you can always learn from stuff, and I think that's a really important. I think that is kind of a sneaky aspect of capitalism. I think especially for those of us who've grown up largely with the influence of the internet and social media, is that you do sort of get these ideas that everything has to be like categorized and marketable. And I think I just remember being a kid because I'm old enough before the internet was a thing. And I would just like pick up a book and read it because I was bored, I would just yeah, like wander around my house, and I would just go to our family bookshelf, and I would just read like random books because I was bored. And that's kind of beautiful. And I think that there is something, I think that it's good for us to pursue stuff that isn't necessarily made for us for a lot of reasons. One, I think definitely is to get the perspective, especially if we're like white or straight or cis. Like, it's very important to hear from people who don't look like us. But I think also, like, you'd be shocked at what will end up changing your life and inspiring you. And it might be something that was made for someone who looks nothing like you. And yet it could be this pearl of wisdom that somehow is the most magical thing. And I think, as we're fighting for this future and fighting against capitalism, I think that kind of curiosity and openness is very counter to capitalist values and ideals.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think also, and again, not to sort of equate people who don't experience these issues with people who do, but I think like I don't have anxiety, for example, but I do get
Lucky.
anxious. Yeah, I do get anxious when I have 1,000 unread emails or something, which I had a while ago. So
Exactly.
it's like, yeah, thinking of these things kind of more of a spectrum, and again, not to sort of equate my experience of being anxious with people who have anxiety, but I think a lot of these things we can all relate to an extent. It's just a matter of sort of not suffering that to the same degree, but often we are experiencing these things in maybe less intense ways as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point. One of the frustrations I have as a disabled person is how much other people think that they're not disabled or think that they're fully able bodied. And yeah, I just know so many people where they're like, oh, well, I don't have a weak immune system. And I'm like, you get sick more than I do. Or, you know what I mean? Or someone who's
Mhm.
like, I don't have anxiety. And I'm like, you're an anxious mess all the time. I think, I think that's part of ableism, is I think we have this idea of disability that it has to be, this very extreme thing. And so I think for a lot of people, they don't see how they are either disabled or just suffering from things like you said. I like the idea of a spectrum for most things,
Mm.
because I do think a lot of things are on a spectrum. Like, who doesn't experience anxiety, right? So yeah, maybe you don't have an anxiety disorder, but you could still benefit from someone who does have an anxiety disorder talking about what they do to navigate life with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think just I think people being more open to seeing the ways in which they may struggle, and the ways in which capitalism is violent against those types of struggles is really valuable. Because I think one of the things that I get the most upset about as a disabled person is how much distance able-bodied people are always trying to put between themselves and me and my experiences, when really in reality we're really not that far apart, especially since my chronic illness is all stress based issues. It's like any one of you could end up in my position. under capitalism, right? Because we're all stressed all the fucking time. And like you could get burnt out just as well as I got burnt out. And you trying to create this distance between us means that you're not going to see it coming when you could have. And you're probably going to blame yourself the way I did for a long time before you realize that it's the system chewing people up, and it's the system creating these unnatural environments and working schedules that are just really designed to wear us out, because they're not something that the regular human body can withstand.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'd be actually curious to get your thoughts on while we're talking about this is there's a podcast a while ago. It's not running anymore, but the Angry Hippies podcast. And I don't think he was saying he came up with this term, just a term he came across in terms of, rather than disability or rather than disabled, of not society enabled. So as in, like, people with a wheelchair can get from A to B, but it's not enabled by society through a ramp, for example. There's stairs, which are kind of set up for people who don't use a wheelchair and that kind of thing. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that concept. And obviously people also do suffer from various disabilities too. Like, I don't think it's necessarily purely sort of the society as well, but what are your thoughts on that kind of concept, like with autism or whatever else about, is it sort of a condition in itself, or is it more about how society treats that?
I think largely it is more how society treats that. And I haven't heard that phrase, but that fits into what I prefer, which is the social model of disability, which says that essentially that I'm not so much disabled as I am, as I'm living in a society that prevents me from being able to move and do what I need to do. And I feel very much that way about autism. Having sensory input sensitivity, it is likely to sometimes make things difficult for me. But for the most part, really the only quote unquote issues I have with my autism are because I live in a neurotypical normative world where extroversion and loudness and distractions and chemicals and all of these things are the things that are valued. Small things like I can't go work in an office building without being assaulted by people's perfumes and colognes. And why don't we have a rule that you cannot wear scents to work? Wouldn't that just make sense? I mean, a lot of people have these kind of allergies, but that would be capitalism having to acknowledge that disability exists and that it's something that should be accommodated, and then it would no longer be a disability, right? But capitalism doesn't want that. Capitalism wants all bodies to be trying to approximate as high productivity as possible all the time, or to go away. So someone like me has to hide that I'm having headaches and that I'm suffering from this stuff at work so that I don't miss out on, say, a promotion, because people think I'm weak, right? Or sickly or picky or finicky or any of these other things that we associate with people who just need a few accommodations, and then we're totally fine.
Yeah, and I did actually read a book a while ago. I think I mentioned this another time speaking to you, but the first one was called the Rosie Project, and they were kind of all Rosie as like a trilogy, and particularly it was sort of about autism and I mean, amongst other things as well, but the main character is autistic, or there was discussion about whether they were autistic and that kind of thing. And particularly in the third book in the series, it really got into like autism rights kind of activism and that kind of thing. And they were sort of arguing what you were arguing, that, often kids are kind of taught like, this is how you fit into this world that discriminates against neurotypical people, rather than actually the focus could instead be, let's change the society to be more accepting and understanding that people are different, rather than trying to get everyone into this one model. So that was kind of really interesting from that point of view too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could literally talk endlessly about my experiences in the corporate world, especially now having this perspective of realizing I'm autistic and having stepped up to like own my disability, you know, and stop apologizing for it. And towards the end of my career, you know, I was really demanding to be accommodated. I was done trying to act like my body wasn't hurting all the time, or act, you know, so I demanded things like a standing desk and flexible hours and working from home. And I was very privileged that I was in a position to do that. But yeah, I think for sure, especially with autism, you can see how much I think it's a special case, because you can really see how much of what people are told is so arbitrary when you realize that you struggle with these things because your brain just works differently. Like, I was a very high performing employee, I was very highly valued, and yet I still struggle constantly with just little things like be like not being extroverted. And it's like, but I'm here creating this amazing work for you and doing incredible work on these projects. And really, you're still going to get on me about, you know, hitting a wall at a certain point, just not being able to like, also I'm, you know, I don't like small talk. I'm not good at lying, you know, and these are all things that are valued in a corporate space. So yeah, it would just be just little things like that. It would be like, I'm such a good worker and I contribute this like incredible work, but then I'm still bumping up against these walls or these blocks in my career because of this like really arbitrary stuff. And it just also highlights how it's a very homogenous space, which I think is always very violent. It wasn't like, and that's why I came from a tech background, and I always kind of preferred that, even though tech has an enormous amount of issues. But I think autism is more accommodated there for obvious reasons. And, you know, I think in a tech space, there are a lot of times at which you can be, say, an amazing programmer, and people just know to leave you alone and let you be a good programmer. But the corporate spaces I was navigating, it's like, it's not enough that you're just really good at your job. You also have to be the same as everyone else, right? You have to have a firm handshake and make good eye contact and be able to go out for drinks after a 10-hour conference and, you know, stay up all night charming your clients. And it's like, why can't I just be the nerd in the background doing my work and being happy with that? Anyway, that was a whole tangent, but yeah, and I think it's important because then we learn to hate ourselves because we don't understand why we're not good at the stuff we're being told we should be good at that makes us a good person. And then we enter activism spaces, and frankly, there's a lot of the same messaging there. A lot of activism spaces are kind of extroverted, and they're you know, focused on things that might be like a loud protest, which might be really hard for someone. Or one of the things that I noticed is a lot of times there's not, like when you volunteer, there's not a lot of clear direction given to you, and there's not a lot of like forewarning or pre-planning on stuff. Not always, but a lot of places I volunteered, you're kind of like show up. Sometimes there's no one even there to greet you or talk to you. You don't know what you're about to do. Then someone throws you on something. They don't even ask about, like, if you need any kind of accommodation or if that would be okay for you. So yeah, I just think there, in a lot of ways, like, we have to look at what we consider normal and good. And I think we always have to interrogate it and be really honest about, wait, why do I think that? And where am I getting that from? Because I do see a lot of these things infiltrate leftist spaces. And then you have people who just feel like shit all the time, both in their day-to-day lives as well as their activist lives, because they're just not good at this very, when you look at it, actually narrow set of skills or traits. But they could be the most valuable activist you've ever had if you would just let them do what they're good at and find joy in.
Yeah, it actually reminds me, just from my academic work, there's a concept called emotional labor, which is all about the
Yes.
emotion I put in. And it's like, you can be a flight attendant and you're like, oh, I'm giving people the meals, I'm doing all the right things, but it's like you're also expected to, smile at people and make people comfortable and all this stuff, particularly in like more feminized forms of work as well. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of that in terms of that corporate environment. And also that
100%.
the same or similar kind of problems within activist movements. I saw a video from the journalist Will Potter, who's sort of from a journalist background, but also an activist background. And he was saying like he's not sure which is worse when it comes to like dealing with mental health issues in terms of activists or journalists, because journalists are always like, you're not experiencing these things, you're just documenting them. Therefore, you're not
Mm,
the real victim. And same with activism, particularly animal activism, like you're not the real victim, so you can't talk about your burnout as well. So a lot of these same issues with ableism and disregarding mental health issues within activist spaces, as well as in corporate
yes.
environments and those kind of things too.
Yeah, a couple of friends and I were actually talking today about, I don't know if you remember this from way back in the day, but I really do not agree with using violent imagery in activism, which is an incredibly unpopular opinion. And, maybe I'll make an episode about that again someday. But anyway, we were talking about this concept, right? Like, I was making my case for why, and my friends were like, I see where you're coming from, but then I also have these thoughts. And just in talking through it, one of the things that really came up for me that I can now put this into perspective is I think one of the reasons I don't agree with that is because I think as an autistic person, I'm incredibly sensitive and I really internalize stuff that I see and hear. And so for me to come across things like that, especially without a content warning, and so often this stuff doesn't have a content warning because that's what they're going for, is to like shock you into seeing something, surprise you and then shock you into changing your ways. I just think, for people who have anxiety, for autistic people, I mean, for a lot of people, that is really damaging. And secondary PTSD is a real thing. You can take on trauma from seeing trauma. And I agree with you. I think this is another kind of patriarchal thing where it's like, don't be a wimp, like you're not experiencing it, buck up, like you need to be strong to advocate for these people, like stop. And it's like, no, this is actual real trauma people are taking on from absorbing these stories and these images. And one of the best things I've done for myself over the years is to absolutely refuse to engage with anything like that. For instance, I host a book club on my Discord, and we just read Revolting Prostitutes, which is a book written by two sex workers about the sex industry. And I was really excited because I wanted to hear their thoughts about the sex industry and like how they thought we could help sex workers and people in the sex trade and stuff. And unfortunately, in my opinion, the book was written to convince SWERFs that criminalizing sex work is the wrong thing to do. So it was just a book that was endless, horrifying stories of what has happened to sex workers and people in the sex trade by police and by Johns. And I got to this point and I was like, you know what? I'm not going to read this. And it took me a little while, but I was like, this is really upsetting me. I already like, fuck the cops, ACAB. Like, I don't need to be convinced that involving police in anything is bad. I'm already on board with that. So it was like, I felt like I was taking these women's stories like into my body, and I was getting really upset and really stressed out because I see them as people, and I'm pained by what happened to them, and I'm really angry at the system, and as like an AFAB person, I'm really sensitive about sexual violence. It's something that I live in fear of all the time and have experienced in certain ways. And so my point is like, I think we have a lot of this conditioning in activist spaces that we're like, bearing witness is something I've heard a lot, especially in vegan spaces, is that we're supposed to watch slaughterhouse footage and we're supposed to look at these graphic images and bear witness to what's happening to these animals. And it's like, terrible advice. Like, that's a terrible thing to tell people to do. Because for a lot of us, like, it is actually traumatizing, and you can sit there and you can say that's weak or that's fake or whatever. It doesn't change the fact that it's real for the people it's happening to. And it's certainly one of probably the main causes of burnout. And it's another thing that ends up causing activists to stop doing things like self-care and to stop doing things that they need to do to recover, like just having fun. Like, I knew one activist in San Diego who literally like wouldn't go out to the movies or go out to dinner or anything because she was like, all that time should be spent fighting for the animals. And it's like, girl, like, you can't, that's not a sustainable life. You can't do that. You know, you have got to live.
Mhm.
And we're not going to win any revolution if we're all these burnt out husks of trauma and just exhaustion. And it actually makes you a worse activist, honestly, because she was the type of person, like, you couldn't even have a conversation with her because she was so hardcore and so like self-punishing that she was not able to really reach other people anymore because they're like, this is a lot. You know, like, I can't, like, you now become one of those quote unquote crazy vegans and I don't want to talk to you. So yeah, it's just this false thing that we're supposed to be super strong and like this stuff doesn't affect us. And it's like, of course it does. Of course it does. And there's plenty that you can do to be aware and to try to educate, make a difference without subjecting yourself to that, without subjecting other people to that.
Yeah, and I think we also, for those using those tactics, I think you have to question whether trauma is a good place to take action from. And I would say probably not. It's not exactly the kind of thing that makes you feel, more active and wanting to do things. It's often like quite the opposite in terms of the reaction to trauma as well. Also, just a couple of terms you brought up there, just in case listeners aren't familiar with these, like SWERFs is sex worker, exclusionary, radical, feminist, AFAB, assigned female at birth as well. But yeah, I do remember hearing someone had actually on this show before, Roger Yates, who's a long time animal activist, has been doing this stuff since the 70s, and he was saying, like, back in previous decades, people would say, do you want to go to the theater? And he'd say, well, I'll go to the theater once the animals are free, that kind of thing. And he's very much like he's very much opposed that now and sort of sees the problems with that, but he was saying that was sort of his attitude back going decades ago. And I think like that kind of attitude also like cuts you off from other people as well. If all you've got to talk about is veganism or whatever social justice issue, it's like you can't actually engage with people about whatever music or TV shows or any other thing. So if they don't want to talk about that, you just cut off those people as well. So I don't think it's really a good way to actually bring about change, and obviously not very healthy for the individuals involved as well. Let's sort of turn it towards capitalism. We're talking about capitalism a lot, but maybe we should as well, talk a bit about what capitalism is and why we don't like it, that kind of thing. Do you want to start off with that?
Sure.
When I say start off, it's about 50 minutes in, but yeah, you know what I mean.
Kick us off. We're just getting warmed up. Yeah, so I guess, like a basic definition is capitalism is an economic system in which private individuals or businesses own capital goods. The production of goods and services is based on supply and demand in the general market rather than through central planning. So what we can see, that's just a definition, but what I think is important to understand about capitalism is that it has a focus and a need for infinite growth. And this is why you see things like corporations have boards of investors. And that is significant because what it means is that the people who are actually controlling the decisions of the company are people who are removed from the workers in the company. And they're literally only focused on profit and numbers. And they control. So even I actually experienced this in my own job, where I had like I was known by the president of the network, like the highest guy up in the company. And I had the ear of several higher ups, um just in that I had made a good impression and they knew me as like a valuable employee. I didn't really have any big pull there because I wasn't in department where I was generating revenue, but I was in a department where I was making their clients happy. So it was weird because I had this good reputation, but I also had limited influence and power. And anyway, the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that was so frustrating to me time after time was that something would come up, like my pay or prospects that I could have. And even if people at the highest level were on board, we still always had this board of investors kind of making decisions about how things would go. So they would make decisions that would impact my department, which would then impact the opportunities that I had. And I think for me, it just really helped to give me a personalized experience of what capital really means. Capital really means that people who will never know your name or even see you are making decisions that impact your day-to-day life and your income and your career. And I think it's been so normalized that this is just how the world works. But capitalism is actually a pretty new kind of thing, and we've had different economies before, and hopefully we'll have different economies after. But there is the alternative to that. There's many alternatives to that, but generally speaking, the alternative to that would have worker owned production. Workers would own the production of goods and would have say over how those goods are distributed and where they go. And that might sound like completely wild, maybe not to people who listen to this podcast, but to people out in the greater world for sure. That sounds wild, but it's actually has a pretty good precedent. And there's pockets where you can see this in action, and it works really well. Think about just in this, like a very simple example. Think about when your boss is out. Does production stop? Does everything fall apart? No. Why? Because that person usually isn't actually there to like help the work get done. The person's there to be an authority figure, to make sure that people are complying with the rules, and also just to provide a hierarchy. Because if you didn't have a manager, then it would become more apparent that the workers are the ones that actually have the knowledge and are actually capable of managing themselves. And there's worker co-ops, and there's all kinds of I wish I could remember specifically. I think if people are interested, looking up Professor Wolf. Am I getting that right?
I think that's right. Yeah. If it's who
I can't remember his first name for some reason right now. But if you want to look up Professor Wolf, he has some lectures out on YouTube. He did one at a particular university that I thought was really good, where he explains what capitalism is, and then he talks about current different places around the world where people are doing something different and how that's actually working out for them. So it shows that like we can even look to things happening today, and we can look back historically and see that there are other options to this model. But we have the idea under capitalism that ownership is a valuable thing, that owning something somehow provides value to that thing. And I cannot tell you how toxic and dangerous that idea is. So an example of that is that this idea about landlords, right? And that owning property and then allowing people to rent that property from you in order to have a home is like this altruistic thing that you can do for other people. When we know, well, like if you actually sat down and think about it, it's like, well, no, we easily could just run this property ourselves. We don't actually need this landlord to own the property for us, right? But that's how our world works right now. It's someone's got to own the property and then allow other people to live there until they decide that they shouldn't live there anymore. And that somehow there's this altruism in owning something, or that you're somehow adding value, or that you somehow earned it by owning it. And that's simply not true. It just means that you had the funds.
Yep.
And that's it.
Yeah, and I guess, sort of starting off, again with that sort of classic Marxist definition of capitalism of, the private ownership of the means of production, which basically means, in terms of workplaces owned by private companies rather than the state in the case of socialism, or the workers themselves, particularly, in like an anarchist kind of situation. But I think so that is sort of part of the problem in terms of that, like lack of democracy within the workplace. And there was a really good documentary, this from a long time ago now, but The Take is based in Argentina, and it was based workers running the factories themselves and actually doing things much better and making decisions themselves, those kind of things. But that's one aspect. But also, as you mentioned as well, sort of an associated thing with capitalism is the need for constant growth. And that means that when we do slow down the economy because of COVID, because of climate change or whatever, then we have this negative social impact on people. So it's sort of this idea of needing to move beyond this constant need of growth for health reasons, for environmental reasons or whatever, and actually being able to slow down the economy without having a really negative impact on people. And the final example I'll give as well in terms of capitalism is also, this is a bit more of a trivial example, but I just thought of because I'm speaking to you today, is like media, and the way in which, because there's that focus on profit rather than, art or meaningful content, or there's that focus on profit. Once a show has like an established market and they know people watch that show, they'll drag that show out again, like on and on and on, because there's already people, even if people complain about it, they already sort of have that established market for that show. And a classic example of that, again, because I'm speaking to you, is Handmaid's Tale, where something can make absolutely no sense for the sake of the story, but they want to drag it out for 7 seasons, so they do things that make no sense as well. So it's a more trivial example, but I think also our entertainment is definitely also affected by capitalism as well.
Oh, 100%. I'm actually rewatching Star Trek Next Generation because that was the one I grew up watching, and I was like, oh, I want to see if this holds up. It does. It might be the greatest show ever made. I have a million criticisms of it, but I also just think it's an amazing show. Anyway, so I'm going through and it has 7 seasons, and it occurred to me now watching it that there are so many stories. Like, I feel that this is a show that actually could have had like 14 good seasons. Like, it was ended way too early. Anyway, so I got into my head. I was like, wait a minute, why did this show why did it have 7 seasons? Because I'm in like halfway through the 7th season. I'm putting off finishing it because I'm going to be so sad. And it just feels like it's not the last season. You know how sometimes when you can feel that it's the last season of a show, this one doesn't feel that way. So it's like, oh, did it get canceled like out of nowhere? What happened? Anyway, I looked it up, and it was that they decided it actually still had huge ratings at the time, but I guess they realized that they could make more money. They were planning to make movies. And so they were like, oh, if the show's still on while the movies are in the theater, then less people will go see the movie. So we're just going to end the show so we can make more money with the movies. And then the movies sucked. So it's like a huge slap in the face. But to your point, I mean, Star Trek, any of them it's more than just a TV show to a lot of people. It's like a really meaningful piece of art to a lot of people for a lot of reasons. And it was something that somehow really resonated with a lot of people. Because watching it back, I'm like, this is such a dorky show. But it was popular because people loved it. And yeah, it got pulled because of money. They were just like, we can make more money by ending this and then just feeding people movies here and there. And that's sucks,
Yeah.
It's really shitty.
Yeah, I've never seen a single episode of that show, so I can't.
You
I
are
can't
missing out, my
comment at all.
friend.
I've definitely, obviously,
So
heard it as
good.
a big cultural point of reference, but I've never seen, I don't think, a second of that show. So,
Oh my God, it's so good. I'm gonna make like 15 million videos about it.
yeah.
Anyway, I'll stop fanning over it, but yeah, it just was one of those moments where I was reading that, like, why it got taken off the air, and I just felt this really deep sense of loss for the world that I could have lived in, where the show could have kept going and had time to like continue exploring all of the themes that it brought up and all of the character arcs that it had. And instead, here we are. And then as someone with a YouTube channel, I'm struggling with this all the time, like trying to make content that's queer and anarchist and all this stuff. And I'm constantly fighting with YouTube about monetization, which I don't really care about, but it means that if my video is demonetized, they're not going to show it to as many people because they can't make money off of it. So it doesn't matter if I make this amazing video that's really important to a lot of people. If they feel that they can't have sponsored ads in it, then I don't get to be seen. It doesn't get to be seen by as many people. And it's like, yeah, that's the world that we're living in. You can do really important Instagram posts that really matter to people and change people's perspectives. But if you don't post every day at key times and keep that algorithm happy, then no one's going to see those posts.
Yeah. And so let's now move on to finish up and talking about we've spoken a bit about this throughout, but some other examples where we've tried to sort of challenge this capitalist mindset or hierarchies in the workplace, everyday life, that kind of thing. Do you want to kick things off, or do you want me to, in terms of some ways?
I could kick things off. So I think it's like I have so many thoughts, but I think one of the key things, and I actually just did an episode about this, which is what Nick was referring to earlier with the to-do lists and stuff, about productivity and just how I made an advice episode about how to be productive as a disabled or neurodivergent person. And in that episode, I talk about like, I think challenging the idea of productivity is really important. And I think it's deeper work than we probably even realize. It's something I've been trying to do for years now. And I'm still constantly uncovering these layers within myself where I'm like, oh, that's still there. It's still lurking in this corner or that corner. So I think, yeah, just this idea, because I think that really deeply integrates into this conversation about activism and accessibility, because part of productivity is that we should be doing stuff all the time and we should be doing stuff that matters, right? And we should be seen as a person constantly in motion. And that in and of itself is inherently ableist, and that in and of itself is inherently kind of I think there's a lot of distraction in that as well. And I think one of the things that capitalism does extremely well is to keep us very distracted. It keeps us very tired, and it keeps us very, there's stimulation everywhere. There's noises, there's sounds, there's alcohol, there's food, there's just clothes and, YouTube and everything around us. The way TV works and all of it is designed to, even the 8-hour workday is literally designed to exhaust you enough that you want to buy things to make you feel better. And you want to buy things to make your life easier because you don't have enough energy left over after an 8-hour workday to actually get all the things done that you would like to do for yourself, right? Like all of your good energy goes towards capital. And then you get home and maybe you want to eat well and you want to work out and maybe you want to do some art or whatever, and you can't really do it. Or you need to order takeout to do that, or you need to order the next newfangled gadget that makes your life easier to do that. So I think challenging productivity can go through all of these layers of like, how do I view myself in terms of value? And do I only value myself when I feel like I'm doing a lot of things? And what does that mean? Could you challenge that? And could you get to a point where you could lay in bed all day if that's what you wanted to do or needed to do, and still feel like you had a lot of self-worth and feel that you were valuable, even though you didn't do a damn thing all day? And can you find that quiet too? Can you cut out all of these external influences and all of this noise telling you how you should be and how you should think and feel? I feel like Twitter especially is just really bad with that. There, sometimes things I like about Twitter, but I think this polarization of opinions and everyone on there just has like this really strong stance on, like, this like finalized, very authoritative stance on what is right and what isn't right. And that doesn't leave a lot of space for us to do that deep internal work to think, well, what do I think? What feels right to me? Or to just read a book and then ponder what you read, right? There's such an impulse now. And I have to fight this all the time. I might read a book and then my first impulse is to go to Goodreads and review it, or to tweet about it, right? Or to make an episode about it. And I'm not saying those things like that you should never do that, but I think there's something to be said for the fact that we don't feel like we can just sit with information anymore. We have to like immediately churn it back out into the world. So I just think all of this, like, challenge productivity and find the quiet and see if you can sit with things and see if you can find your own voice again, because it's probably been fairly lost if you ever even truly had it in the first place, because we've been told from birth, you know, what we're supposed to be and what's valuable to society. And that, for me, part of my disabled and autistic journey was finding a lot of deep anger over those cultural narratives that had caused me to devalue myself my whole life, and find and doing the work to cut those out and challenge those and really sit with it and get, you know, very much a work in progress, but trying to get towards a place where I can determine my own self-worth without these external factors, and that I can determine my own self-worth by the things and values that I judge other people by, because they certainly don't judge other people by how much they do in a day, right? I judge my friends and the people I want close to me by if they're kind and if they're curious and, you know, if they make me feel good and things like that. And it's like, well, why can't I judge myself that way? Why do I still have this very capitalist idea of what makes me valuable?
Yeah, and I think that that focus on productivity is very much within activist kind of scenes, in terms of that idea of like having to do more, otherwise you're not the best activist, which obviously feeds into burnout a lot. And even as ourselves as individuals on social media and that kind of thing as well, that desire to be constantly productive. And it's definitely something I've you know made an effort to do, of actually commenting less on things. So I think whenever there's something
Yes.
trending, there's an event, and yeah, it's like, oh, you have to have your take on it. And like I've
Yeah.
done that. I've been guilty of that myself. Years ago, there was the Charlie Hebdo shootings around, like,
Mm.
Islamophobia and that kind of thing. And I wrote an article on that, but like I didn't actually even really know anything about the magazine, and I kind of criticized them for something where they were actually, parodying something rather than actually that was what they were promoting. Not to say parody gives you a free pass, but it's just like I just didn't know enough, and I probably should have been like, okay, that's happening, and I don't need to comment on that. And just because you don't comment on an issue doesn't mean you don't care about it or whatever. But not feeling the need to be constantly productive on social media as well, I think is important.
Yeah, I think it's very important. And I love what you said, because that's something I've actually not struggled, I've struggled against it pretty mightily for years now, is to continue to check myself and be like, you're not that interesting. um, Meaning, and that's funny for someone who has a podcast that regularly goes to like 2 hours, but meaning just like, yeah, you don't need to have your voice in everything. Not everything needs to be commented on. And I don't ever want to, I've noticed myself slip into that sometimes, where I'm like, oh, people probably want to hear my thoughts about this. And it's like, I just think that can be a dangerous space to get into, when it becomes too comfortable and too automatic. When you're just like, oh yeah, I should comment on everything because I'm a public figure. And I just, for so many reasons, I'm like always wanting to challenge that. And yeah, I've done similar things where stuff will happen and I feel that, oh, I should comment on this, and then I realize I don't know anything about this. Why am I jumping in,
Mm-hmm.
And I've also I think in a similar vein, I've really tried to push back on myself from doing performative things online. So like when it was Black History Month, I didn't make a Black History Month post because I just feel like that's really performative. And I know that that's considered like cancelable, but it was like, I'm always talking about Black theory, especially like Black feminist theory and like Black queer theory. So it's like, I don't know. It's just like, I'm going to do the same thing that I do all the time, which is like talk about this diverse range of theories and voices and share all these different people, than to make this performative one, like specific post to be like, I'm doing the thing I'm supposed to do right now. And I think that can be scary for people, but it's also quite liberating to be like, stop doing the things you think you're supposed to do, because it is performative, and then it keeps us from doing the deeper work, you know?
Yeah.
So I just comment on what I feel really inclined to comment on. And a lot of times I've realized now, it's better for me to take stuff to my live streams or my podcasts and talk about it there in a meaningful way, and to like let myself, I think part of my issues with performative and like response social media activity, like where you're just responding to things that are happening, is like, again, we're not giving ourselves time to sit with stuff and to just kind of like take in other voices and just to think and like let it settle. And I think that that's really important work. I think it's really important to deeply think about things that have happened and how you want to talk about them. Like I didn't post anything when the shootings of the massage parlor workers happened recently, where all those Asian women, I think one Asian man, were killed by a shooter. I forget where it was. This is also my problem, is I have the worst memory in the in the entire world. Anyway, I didn't do a social media post about that because I didn't know what to say that didn't just sound hollow and like, oh, I'm just saying this to say it. But then I found a Sonia Renee Taylor video about the incident that I thought was really powerful, and how she talked about like whiteness and racism and male privilege and all these things. So I played that on my live stream, and then we talked about it for a little while. And to me, like, that was the more significant thing that I could do, right? Is to think about it and then find someone who had phrased it in this really powerful, concise way, and to share their media, and then to make a little space for us to talk about it as a community. So I think not everyone has a platform where they can do that, but you have friends, you have family, like it's okay not to always be the person on social media saying things. And I felt that I had become that person for a lot of people. And I realized that it was kind of like a dangerous role to take on. I think especially as white people, we always have to be really careful about how important we think our opinions and our voices are. Not to say we never have stuff to say, but I think it's very easy to kind of go along with that and not really interrogate, like, wait, do I actually need to say something right now?
Yep, for sure. And I think that is one thing I like about podcasting, of rather than
Mm,
constantly, just posting about whatever's trending, of actually going, here's something I feel like I do have something to contribute to, and saying something in more depth about that, rather than commenting on something every day as well. And I guess an example I wanted to give, which is not so much the anti-capitalism, more about challenging those hierarchies, which is as an academic, as a teacher at
mm,
university, thinking about the ways in which obviously it is a hierarchy and it is an authoritarian position in a way. And it's often something I point out to students when I'm teaching on inequalities, like what inequalities are happening right now. Like I'm talking and you're listening, and sort of trying to raise those as well. But just thinking about the ways of making classes like less hierarchical. And I have done plenty of lecturing before. At the moment, I'm mostly doing tutoring, a bit of lecturing, but tutoring is the like smaller classes, more interactive, those kind of things. I think it is like less hierarchical in itself. But
mhm,
I had one moment in a class a while ago, back before I was teaching online, where Yeah, basically the students were, well, I was writing things on the board, but then I got the students to actually like write their own things up on the whiteboard. And then one of the students who was up there was basically, oh, I'll just stay up here and write the other thing. So basically, it was a student up there writing the other whiteboard and writing on the whiteboard, and the students were kind of calling out to her, and she was writing. And so I was just sitting in the corner not doing anything. It was just this really nice moment of like, not from a lazy point of view, but just like, oh, I'd actually, there's a sort of an environment where they were just sort of learning from themselves rather than me as this authority figure sort of giving the knowledge as well. So I think we can, within our workplaces, find ways to, again, not escape hierarchies, but try to sort of do things in less hierarchical ways where we can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think education for sure is a big one. I think the biggest irony of how our education, our formal education institutions are structured is that because I study learning to be as good of a trainer, facilitator, educator as I can, um, the highest form of learning is actually teaching. So it's wild to me that we do not have education that's structured around the students teaching, because we're actually keeping from them the deepest experience of learning in these systems that are supposedly built to be places of learning. So I love that. I think, yes, anytime a teacher, a professor has control of a classroom where they can create that environment to allow the students to teach as much as possible and to share these, because you know from doing it, even standing up in front and writing stuff, like it just imbues you with this instant authority, right? And it gives you this, so yeah, can you hand that off to a student? Can you mix that up and let them all, and kind of not only give them a bit of authority, but also kind of dilute how much authority that gives you by the fact that now it's been normalized for everyone to do it. And I think that's really critical. And I would do similar things in my job as well. I would volunteer a lot of times to do little projects where I would be project manager. And as I got further in my career, I would have projects that I was leading as part of my job. And I just always like immediately was like, we're a worker co-op here. Like we're going to function. I'm a leader in the sense that I'm going to help keep track of what's happening, and I'm going to help keep us like informed of what we need to know. But I'm not a leader as in like my word is authority or that I'm making the decisions by myself. Like we're all here to do that work together. I'm actually here to just make this easier for all of you. That is my job as the leader. And it's really effective. And it was amazing how much bonding, like deep bonding, I would experience with my coworkers leading projects in that way, because it was so different from what they had experienced on other projects, that we would like emotionally bond over how much fun we had working together, because this different vibe was so conducive to building community. Whereas, you know, normally you're used to just being told what to do and not really having any emotional investment in the projects. And I think that shows, again, just how much the hierarchy that's inherent in capitalism really does disconnect people from one another, and creates these barriers. Even in situations like, you think a job where you're literally physically with these people and working with them 40 plus hours a week, and yet there's ways that you're just still so disconnected from one another by design. So yeah, I think anytime you can challenge that, anytime you have a bit of power and authority, see what you can do to immediately give it away. And I swear the results will just be like the most amazing thing that you've ever experienced.
And I'm going to give 3 quick examples for myself, because I know
Ooh,
Nick's
love
still
it.
going to do videos and stuff today as well, so I don't want to keep you too long. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples, and then hand it over to Nick for any examples you want to give, and then then we'll wrap up. So 3 examples I've got, again, fairly trivial examples, but just sort of this idea of thinking about capitalism, how it sort of relates to our own lives. So a few years ago, actually, actually, we had tickets to the grand final, the football, like the Australian football, the grand final, which is a big deal, and music and stuff like that. So it goes for like 5 or 6 hours or something like that. And so we bought 2 tickets, and me and my partner Katie, and we were actually sitting on other sides of the stadium. Just the way it worked out, it's really hard to get tickets and stuff like that. And we sort of decided, like, especially with such a long thing, it's not going to be that great to sit by ourselves and actually, you know, go there. So we actually wanted to sell the tickets. And because this is such a big deal, like probably like your Super Bowl, I guess, in
Yeah,
America.
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's like such a big deal that, you know, people, we put the tickets up just to sell them, and people were offering like ridiculous amounts of money to for these tickets, and so we could have gone to like the highest bidder in terms of just like whoever had the most money was the richest and could afford that, but we ended up just, I guess, from a bit more of a human perspective of giving it to someone who wanted to have the ticket for their mum, who was like a really big fan of this team, and she was actually chronically or terminally ill and was actually, you know, going to pass away soon. We sort of gave it more on a human perspective rather than whoever could give us the most money and whoever had that money as well. So again, thinking about like sort of doing things from more a human perspective rather than a capitalist perspective. Also, another example, this is from our old apartment, but we don't have a car, so we rented out our car bay. And the landlord put up the price of our rent, and we couldn't afford the rent anymore, so we bumped up the price of the parking bay. And I kind of felt bad about that. And one thing I never did, but I was kind of thinking would be a nice thing to do if we had more money, of actually like reducing the cost of that car bay for that person who we had quite a good relationship was, and seemed like a nice person as well. And we ended up moving from that place. But just a little thing of always like, rather than trying to maximize the money you can make, of actually, again, sort of a more human perspective. And my final example comes from finding things on the street, which we often talk about, like finding furniture and that kind of thing for free that people have just chucked out for, you know, environmental reasons, that kind of thing, trying to consume less stuff. And I picked up a couple of couches that we put on our balcony at our old apartment, and our dogs destroyed it. Like they tore it up, and just because they like chewing on the thing. And it's like, I didn't really care because I hadn't actually put down any money. I think there's this sort of like, in capitalism, every time we buy something, there's like consciously or unconsciously, where like that much labor went into buying that thing. And so actually, just by like reusing stuff that's already been thrown out, you can actually sort of challenge that mindset and be like less attached to your stuff, I guess. Yeah, because you haven't actually sort of put in that labor to create it. I do enjoy my job as an academic, but I think that there is still other things I want to do beyond work as well. So that does come into it to some extent. So there are a few examples I have, and I'll hand over to Nick to give any other examples you want to give before we take off.
I think some of these we touched on earlier, so I'll skip over those. But the last two that I had were, you know, find and follow your, I think Adrienne Marie Brown calls them sacred yeses, if I remember. It's so funny because I think I realized recently that I've never actually read Pleasure Activism, but my friends quote it so much I thought that I had.
I'm the same. Yeah, I've heard like Mexi talk about it, so I feel pretty moved. I haven't read a word of that book. Yeah.
Exactly. So I might be misattributing this, and if so, I apologize, because it's something I actually hear from Mexi and Marine all the time. But yeah, it's become really true in my life that part of it is getting away from what other people value in order to chase the things that you value. So this could be your stereotypical, you know, my parents want me to be a doctor, but I want to be an artist kind of thing. But I think it can also impact our lives in much smaller and more subtle ways. So for me, just realizing that, like making social media posts on Twitter is not really something I enjoy doing, truly, you know, and it's not something that's additive to my life. And I think for me, this has been especially poignant because I have such limited energy that, you know, to start to see my energy as precious and as something that should go to me first versus like other people, you know, either to impress other people or to work for other people or whatever, has been really kind of revolutionary for me. So anyone who followed my podcast since I've started it, you know, I was initially live streaming with other people and just posting those as podcast episodes. And then I realized like I missed podcasting, and I hated trying to edit the audio from the live streams because it was always a mess, and just all these other things. So I realized like for me, live streaming became so much more joyful when I could just be in the moment of like, this is just what's happening now, and not having to think about this being a podcast later. And then being able to go back to podcasting and be able to sit with the mic and do that and be in that space. So anyway, that's just about what I do, but it's been really important for me to every step of the way since I blew up my life and like changed everything in the last year, to just say, okay, what is actually adding value to my life, and what are the steps that I can take? Like I still have to pay my bills, right? So like what are the best bangs for my buck here of things that I actually enjoy doing that can get me there? And sometimes you don't always have the privilege of that, but I just think it's always a really important exercise, because I think like often we think that we need to do certain things to be successful, and a lot of times like they don't even actually end up working. And if they're draining the hell out of us, like I guess my point is too, like I have realized that I can live off so much less money than I thought. And part of that is because I'm not miserable doing all these things I thought I needed to do to make enough money to live, right? Like if I had known I needed this little money to live. Now, granted, it's still a lot more than it should be. I live in, Southern California, and the rent here is outrageous, but it's still a lot less than what I was making before. And I was still kind of struggling. I mean, I had a bit of expendable cash, but I was making so much more money before, and I still didn't feel like I was making enough money. So then I was like, oh, I've got to take these classes, and I've got to throw myself into this project at work and make a really good impression so I can get a promotion and get a raise, or I can go to a new company and get like a huge bump in pay. And now I'm like, wow, I'm living off of like a third of what my salary was before and having about the same amount of expendable income. Damn, like I guess I can just be happy and do what I need to do. So I think I know my situation is probably pretty unique, but I think always taking a step back and just following the yeses in life, like what is saying yes to me when I do it, and what is feeling like a no. And I've had stuff, I've had actual business opportunities. I've had stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm fucking broke and I'm like struggling financially, but I'm struggling joyfully, if that makes sense. Like I'm happier doing this than I've had other opportunities come up, and they've just felt like I could feel in my body that it was a no. And even though it would have solved my financial issues, it would have made me miserable. So I think in all ways, like look at the relationships in your life. Who are you spending your time and energy with that maybe makes you feel bad? And can you just not do that anymore? Can you put up boundaries? Do you work out and hate the workouts that you're doing? I used to do that. I used to go to the gym and be miserable, and now I do different stuff that I actually look forward to doing. Do you eat in a way that you hate that makes you miserable because you think that's how you're supposed to eat? And can you change that? Sometimes we can't. I'm someone who has to be careful about what they eat, but just because of like allergies, but just in so many ways, like there's so many things we do in a day that feel like a no that we just keep doing because we think we have to. And so I say, like, open yourself up to those sacred yeses and chase joy wherever you can. And I think you'll be amazed at how much will actually end up working out that you had convinced yourself like wouldn't work out.
Yeah, and actually, your points there about like friends and relationships and stuff just reminds me of a joke or just a comment from one of my favorite comedians, Mike Kaplan, who I've had on the show a bunch. But when he's at live shows, he'll say like, "Who's got friends that they like?" and people with their hand up. Then he's like, "Who has friends that they don't like?" People their hand up, and he's like, "Why? Like, why do you have these friends that you don't like?"
Love that.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess to wrap things up, just to hand over to you to get a chance to say anything that you wanted to say, you didn't say, but also to give plugs for Pynk Spots. I highly recommend the podcast. Obviously, episodes that are particularly relevant to what we're discussing today, I think that episode on being being shy and introverted and content
Mhm.
creator or something like that with Pearson, and also the episode on being productive for people with disabilities and those who are neurodiverse. Yeah, those kind of episodes. But I highly recommend that. Yeah, all those shows, and I think your show is one I always get a lot out of and really enjoy. And I think also, yeah, I don't know, there's something about it that actually it really encourages me to think and come up with new ideas. I think a lot of podcasts I listen to go, yeah, I enjoyed that. And that's kind of end of story. Whereas yours, I'm like,
Mhm.
yeah, it really makes me think and sort of helps me to develop my own ideas as well, which is probably why we've had you on the show quite a bit. But yeah, just hand over you any plugs, anything you want to say to finish up.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. That is amazing to hear. Always, that's the goal. Um, yeah, I have recently created a divide between my podcast channel and my YouTube channel and my podcast. So yeah, you can find Pink Spots, the podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. Um, and I just echo what Nick said. I think the recent episode about how to be productive as a chronically ill slash neurodivergent person is really applicable to the topic today. I did also, yes, the episode with Pearson where we talked about how to do public speaking as an introverted, shy, or anxious person was ended up being like a really rich episode, which I shouldn't be surprised because Pearson's so great. But we went into a lot of deep stuff, and also had tips, which is which is kind of my jam. And even I just did an episode where this week where I was just really wiped out from getting my second COVID vaccine and was experiencing a lot of ableism and just decided to do like a rant about that. And I think that even kind of ties in to what we talked about today in terms of like just listening to other people's experiences and how they view the world. And I think that can help you, even if you're not, say you're not chronically ill or you're not neurodivergent. I think listening to the way that I interpret things that happen to me and around me, I think could maybe liberate you as well to challenge some things that happen to you or around you. Because the ableism that I experience might just be more overt, or I might be more sensitive to it, but we all experience ableism under capitalism all the time. Every time you feel like you have to go to work when you're sick or whatever, like that's you experiencing this stuff. So I think in wrapping it up, my final tip is to just listen to diverse voices and approaches and invest in what resonates with you. And then don't worry about the rest of it, but just be someone who can really listen to other people. I think again, there's a homogeny of voices a lot of times in leftist spaces. There's usually like a party line and a certain viewpoint that gets pushed, and I think it's just really super important to listen to a lot of different people and just have the openness to let the information kind of flow over you, and just chew on stuff and see what's interesting to you and what you may want to think about or read more about or pursue further. But I think that's really important. So, and if you happen to be someone who likes YouTube videos, I know I'm learning that a lot of podcast people don't. There hasn't been a lot of crossover, which is cool. But I do also have a YouTube channel, also called Pynk Spots, same spelling. And that's really fun because twice a month I live stream, and we do a sex stream once a month where we talk about sex related topics from a radical leftist feminist perspective. And then usually the other live stream in a month is me just talking about some kind of vulnerable, squishy topic with a friend of mine. So if that sounds interesting to you, then look me up over there.
Right, and you can subscribe to Nick's channel right there. You can subscribe channel there. No, we're not going to do any. We're
Yeah.
not going to do any of that stuff. We're not going to have anything floating around. No frills video, but I'll make sure I put in the description a link to Pynk Spots. So make sure you subscribe there if you are a YouTube person. I'll also put a link in the description to this song we're going to finish up with. So we're going to finish up with "Purge the Poison" by Marina. Really great song, feminist issues, anti-racist, but also features the lyric "Capitalism made us poor." So I thought that was a very relevant one
Yes.
to, for this discussion. So thanks so much once again for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.